Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 8. Composition. The temple was not as he remembered it at all. The multitude of light crystals and torches reduced the blue flames on the dais to mere pinpricks in a sea of lights. It reminded him a little of the stones he had tried to reach on the hilltop, a dark dome with beckoning, unreachable jewels. He was nervous to re-enter the place where he had had such a strange dream 2 days before, yet there was no magic now, only an intimidating coldness and formality augmented by the presence of a large number of priests in their hooded ceremonial robes. Somehow they controlled the atmosphere of the gathering, and set the mood of all those present, from the anxious adolescent initiates ranged before the dais, to their relatives seated in small wedges of familiarity round the arena. Yet there was an excitement, too, especially among the 13 other boys now also arrayed in the scarlet and gold of the guard. They stood motionless, shoulder to shoulder, stretching away to his left, and he was acutely aware that they were all taller and bigger than he was. The flushed faces and set mouths testified of their nervous anticipation. This was their moment. The boy next to him, Den, was finding it hard to contain his exhilaration and remain motionless. Although he also hailed from Belruth and lived in the castle proper, it was the first time he could enter the temple. He was 15, dark-haired, and half a head taller than Gareth, but his large eyes and freckled face made him seem of a comparable age. Although he had known Den only since the morning, Gareth had taken a liking to him, for he was amicable enough, and had greatly admired the exquisite naming sigil and dragon emblem Gareth wore. Nor did he seem to mind the fact that Gareth was his junior by 3 cycles. The liking appeared to be mutual, for Den had needed no encouragement to move into the empty half of Gareth's room in the barracks. For the moment, though, Gareth envied him his excitement. He could not help feeling a little resentment towards Euban. Somehow the incomprehensible test of the previous day had robbed him of the most coveted moment an initiate dreamed of, receiving one's blade during the presentation. He would be given a blade with the rest, but unlike them he would have to return it to Euban as soon as the ceremony was concluded. He would rather not have received anything at all. Beyond this, he was ill at ease in the temple, and dared not look at the stone or even the flames. He did not know how Euban had accounted for their extinguished state, nor if it had caused him to fall into disfavor with Quester Talon. Surely he had been interrogated by now. It was not in the nature of the priests to ignore an infraction of any kind. Rather, they seemed to look for reasons to accuse and persecute, whether these reasons were valid or not. A twinge of guilt overcame the resentment he felt towards the old man. The initiates remained thus, frozen in place, for what seemed an hour, before there was a stirring among the black-robed and hooded priests. These latter, who had remained as motionless as the boys in front of them, at the intimation of a quester, suddenly emitted a deep-throated hum, a steady droning that slowly increased in volume till the dark dome of the temple itself seemed to be resonating with it. Then followed a display that was designed to impress. A wordless chant commenced that ebbed and flowed among the groupings of priests on the dais. Now and then the quester would insert a word of command, intertwined with a macabre harmony, and hardly discernible, that would cause the colored crystals to alter their intensity in seeming response to the chanting. Thus, the blues, reds, or purples would become predominant in turn, bathing the proceedings in successive single tones of illumination. As the incantation rose in dramatic intensity, the colors all faded to a dull blue haze, concentrated behind the stone itself and setting it off in stark relief. The High Quester Talon chose this moment to make his appearance. His hood was turned back to reveal his vulturine head in the half-dark, the eye sockets shadowy and empty. He looked, paradoxically, much like the epitome of the sorcerer his order had been raised up to eradicate. Behind him came 5 more priests, with the standards of Nuria. Gareth could feel Gen's body next to him trembling at the sight. The blue crystals brightened sufficiently to allow all the spectators to observe the divination. Talon reached the center of the platform and slowly bowed to the stone. Gareth could not help wondering what would happen if the quester touched it. But instead of allaying the boy's curiosity, Talon proceeded to the first initiate in line, furthest from Gareth. Here he paused for a moment, then he gripped the boy's head between his hands. The ethereal sounds of the priests now settled down to a low throbbing, as though they were beating dully on invisible drums. The High Quester started mumbling unintelligibly for a while, and then called the name of the boy and the city of his origin, followed by several more incomprehensible words. There was a flickering among the red crystals. A priest stepped out from among the rest, and handed Talon an unsheathed blade. The boy dropped to his one knee as he had been instructed beforehand, received the blade from Talon, and remained in that position as the quester moved on to the next initiate. The voices, which had risen momentarily, dipped again as the process was more or less repeated. From the reverent silence behind him, Gareth knew that the relatives were thoroughly impressed by this display. He marveled that such sounds as emanated from the priests could be produced by Nurian throats. Yet he struggled with his own nervousness now, not that he feared the incantation the quester would utter over him, but rather the touch of the man's skeletal hands on him, that might even cause him to cry out or draw back. The repetitive nature of the striking ritual was, unfortunately, its undoing. Long before the approaching divinatory incantation reached him, Gareth perceived restive movements among the crowd. Those who had already witnessed their sons or nephews receive the divine sanction had little else to look forward to, and fell to whispering in an attempt to alleviate the boredom induced by the 2-hour-long proceedings. He was grateful that he would be the last to drop to his knee, and had not to remain that way throughout. Thus far, all the divinations had endued the recipients with seer blades, but it would be entirely possible for one or more of the initiates to be awarded one of the lesser blades. To pass the time, Gareth kept a close watch on the priest bringing up the weapons for Talon to hand over. He wondered how many blades of other types were kept on the platform, and if it would be possible for the priests to be caught without a certain type when the High Quester called for it. That would certainly create a stir. He noted how the priest would keep the blade at the ready, so that he might hand it over at the right time. The man's unfailing anticipation could be explained by the fact that all the blades had been of one type. Then a curious thing happened. Talon suddenly called for a yak blade instead. The priest, however, did not hesitate, or exchange the blade he held for another. He marched up and handed over the one he had held at the ready. Gareth half expected Talon to send it back, but he never hesitated either. The initiate received his yak blade. It was quite evident that the priest had known beforehand the yak would be called for, and if he had known, then certainly Talon had also known. Why then was he going through the elaborate process? He had to be pretending. Once the initial shock had worn off, he found that he was hardly surprised. The proceedings had lacked real substance from the outset. The lights, The chanting and the ritual were presented only to dazzle the participants and onlookers alike. The discovery took the sting out of his waiting, and by the time Talon's hands closed round his temples, they were no more than the hands of any other man, and he knew the memory of it would not return to him in the night. Throughout the afternoon the initiates remained round the stone in silent vigil, while the relatives had already joined the king and his captains for the inaugural feast. They held their newly acquired blades at the ready, though none of them could compose them as yet, and Gareth cherished the hours he would be allowed to pretend he possessed one of his own. They stood at intervals now round the platform, and facing away from each other and the stone in the centre. He knew the blade he held was a seer, and enjoyed the light yet solid weight of it in his hand. He felt tremendously powerful, as if this tool could mete out more than just death. He thought of the land of Argoth, where the blades were fashioned in rivers of fire by the diminutive Vadran. He could almost feel the pulsations of their trembling slopes, the immeasurable energies of the red mountains in which they dwelt. He closed his eyes for a moment or two the better to imagine it. The stone behind him was stirring. Perchance it had come from the same flowing fires. There was an answering stir in the blade he held, and he opened his eyes in fright. The magic fled to his relief, and the now familiar lightness returned. He kept his eyes staring straight ahead, and fervently hoped that the others had not noticed anything. The remaining hour of the vigil was a torment of suspicions and questions he knew no one would answer. Somehow the visions of 2 nights before had swirled into his memory in agonizing clarity. He had been close to where he was standing now, when he had seen those strange sights and heard the painful voice, and yet he had not been here, but somewhere on a shore with unfamiliar stars overhead. Had it been some place in the far-away south? There was the walking figure of a man, and the renewed ache of it paralyzed him. At one stage the voice was so clear he longed to raise his hands and place them over his ears. How shallow, how useless was the presentation after all! Laced with pretense and hypocrisy, it was just another way to hide the truth. Slowly, like the soft rippling of the sun-bathed dark weed, words flowed about him, through him, till he whispered them under his breath, for they were his own after all, and not mere scribbles on decayed parchment.
I hold the promise unfulfilled.
And in himself he knew for certain that all the falsehoods could not deter him, that the gifts the Birdman had mentioned could not be taken from him.
Use the gifts I gave.
He would. Nothing would prevent him.
I hear no other voice.
Inside him now welled up the firm assurance, a similar awareness that made the broad wing soar on nothing but the air, because that was its gift.
I heed no other force.
He trembled with elation. Truth was but a breath away.
I mind no other choice.
He was no Nurian plaything for the priests to lead by the nose.
I take no other course.
In his body pulsed the untamable blood of Viron kings, and he would walk in the ways they had, the ways of the art. And soon the stars would share their secrets. The vision would be understood. The feast was as great a disappointment to him as the presentation had been. The initiates were seated with their relatives, but he was not allowed to sit at the royal table, and he had to be satisfied with Malvor instead. The latter hardly spoke a word to him during the proceedings, and when he did, it was some comment of correction and reproof. The boy was also acutely aware of the absence of the blade that had been his for only a few short hours. The music and gaiety was entirely wasted on him. He spent his time resentfully studying the priests, who occupied a full side of the great hall, and were as boisterous and gluttonous as the rest of the company. The chanting had apparently been thirsty work, for their goblets were raised in greedy regularity. Gareth was struck by how tame they looked when not hooded in the half-dark. He glanced over at Den, who was all bright-eyed and smiling. 2 other men in his family were arrayed in the red and gold. Both seemed proud of him. He wondered at the brooding silence of his own father. There had to be a matter of importance claiming his attention. Lucain also attended the feast, but he seemed far more interested in the serving girls than the actual proceedings or entertainment. Gareth smiled to himself. His brother had a reputation to uphold. Talon occupied the space to the right of the king, where the queen should have been. Her ill health had once more been offered as excuse for her absence, and this had been casually accepted by all present, except perhaps the High Quester, who filled up her place at the table. He had glanced keenly at Fengor when the latter had made the customary excuse, his raised eyebrows displaying his doubt and disapproval. When the king had raised his cup to drink to the improved health of his wife, Talon had not stirred to oblige him with the rest, and Gareth had found it hard to dispel the memory of another cup, carrying its lethal contents to another mouth. Talon was presently glancing round the hall in an unsmiling manner, and when his gaze fixed on Gareth, the boy had to suppress a shudder. Why was it that the man hated him so? For certainly it was hate he could see in that dark stare. It was a relief to him when he was allowed to retire to his room and leave the guests to carouse till the second watch. The other initiates had retired at the same time, for training would commence on the morrow.
Den, it was a lie, an act.
Gareth glanced sideways at the other boy, half fearing his reaction. Den shrugged.
Whatever it takes. I have my blade. I don't like the Questers any more than you do. If they pretend and deceive, it is no concern of mine, as long as the system runs smoothly.
He caressed the ornate grip of the weapon with something like worship, then drew it slowly from its sheath. The room seemed to brighten momentarily as the short chrysolite blade caught the light. He held it up in admiration.
I have thought of little else for the last 3 cycles. This is what I was born for, a true Viron blade.
His grey eyes were staring, the feline pupils slits of black.
I cannot wait to learn its secrets, to wield it as it should be.
He lowered it suddenly, glancing down at Gareth.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You'll get...
He seemed truly embarrassed for his lack of tact. His cheeks actually gained a little color. Gareth smiled at him. This was certainly someone with whom he could get along.
It's not what you think, Den. I know what they are doing. They can't teach you anything, not in the way you hope anyway.
What do you mean? Who are they?
You know, the Questers, the tutors. They seem all clever and wise and put it out that you can't know anything without them. You sweat and groan under their tuition, and they teach you nothing you didn't know already. Letters, language, lore. That's all they really gave me, but nothing important, nothing about the art.
Den's eyes widened.
This is dangerous talk, Gareth. I don't like what you're saying.
You know it's true. What about Garrett? He found...
What about him?
Den was angry now, his face scarlet.
Garrett broke the rules. He shouldn't have been in the temple. He brought it on himself, and they...
They murdered him.
Den was on him in a flash, his eyes flaring. He grasped the front of the younger boy's surcoat and pinned him to the wall.
You didn't know him. He was reckless. He cared nothing for authority. He almost had me go with him, the fool.
Gareth did not flinch. He felt reckless too, tired of keeping secrets.
Do you know what he saw in the temple? Was it worth killing him for? What secret do they want to keep so badly?
I don't want to know.
The grip relaxed, allowing Gareth to regain his footing.
I begged him not to go. He laughed at me. He called me a coward. He said the ancient ones would reward him, that he would expose the old crows. I never spoke to him again.
He turned away, his voice having betrayed his true feelings.
They couldn't afford letting him live.
You're an easy one to talk. What exactly do you know about them? How old are you? 12 cycles? You don't know a thing. All these wild accusations of yours are going to get you into bigger trouble than you can imagine. You shouldn't even be an initiate as yet. No wonder.
He broke off.
No wonder they won't trust me with a blade, eh?
I wasn't going to.
It was all pretending, Den. You know it. You blindly believe them. You never ask why. You're a sheep.
Den was looking at him in something close to pity now.
Look, Gareth, you can think what you like. I know you are too young.
And who made that rule? Who determined that?
It's something stretching back hundreds of cycles. How can a little boy like you presume to know better?
Because I've seen. I know they're hiding things.
Look around you. We have the greatest kingdom around the inland sea. Our warriors are unmatched. Our enemies dismayed. We have the questers to thank for that.
Den's anger had completely given way to pity now.
Gareth, I don't care what people say about you.
What? What do people say?
The question was a little too sharp, revealing the pain beneath. Den hesitated.
It matters not. You're the king's son, Gareth. Oh, why do you have to be so... Look, you disobeyed every tutor that they placed over you. You respect no one, not even the High Quester. You don't regard what makes us what we are. People are whispering terrible things, but you've given them reason to.
What do they whisper?
The voice was pleading now, yet puzzled.
Don't you know?
Den was incredulous.
Tell me.
Den turned away to stare out of the window. He placed both hands on the windowsill and lowered his voice.
It's mostly your mother. They say the king should never have married again, that you carry her strange ways, that it will submerge his house in misfortune and dishonor. Old wives' tales. Some even hold that you are not his son at all, that she bewitched the king into taking her in with her son, fathered by some tree spirit. Things along those lines. I'll admit that most of these rumors stem from your mother's reclusive behavior. But you do your best to add fuel to the fire, it seems. She has made herself very unpopular, Gareth, and she never does anything to disprove what is being said. Some of this is rubbed off on you, and to listen to you, I would say with good reason.
Gareth had seated himself on his bunk and drawn his knees up under his chin.
And you? You believe these things?
The fast fading light played over his face, his eyes overlarge in mute accusation. The older boy turned to him with a laugh.
Of course not. But rumors are dangerous things. One should not encourage people to speak ill of one.
He smiled suddenly.
I sound as wise as a quester. See, that comes from occasionally listening to one's tutors.
He made an effort to break the wall of feeling.
My, they told me you'd be a troublemaker, but I could never imagine.
They told you. They make rules. They say things I know aren't true. Den, I don't like Murians, even if I am one myself.
You don't have to like them. Just try to heed them once in a while.
The first stars appeared behind him as he spoke.
They've picked you well, at least. That's mayhap part of the reason for presenting me this early. Tell me, will you repeat to them everything I was fool enough to say?
Den went livid with rage. For a moment it looked like he might strike the smaller boy. He clenched and unclenched his fists, muscles knotting along his jaw. With an effort he turned away and stalked off to light the wall lamp. This he proceeded to do with a fury, almost destroying the flint in the process. Gareth let his feet back down and tried to look remorseful.
Forgive me. That was the only foolish thing I've said this afternoon.
His voice was low and truthful.
The only.
Den whirled back to him.
What's the matter with you? You have the king for a father, the best tutors at your beck and call. You're presented at 12 cycles. All these things, and you sit there with your unhappy face as if you've been cheated. Why do you have to question everything? Why?
He threw up his hands in despair.
I've seen you often. Never a smile, always sullen and defiant. You're likable enough.
Thank you.
The tone was sarcastic.
But you insist on being disliked. Aren't you ever happy? Why must everything be so bad to you?
Gareth made no reply, but sat glumly, stoop-shouldered, the very picture of unhappiness. How could he explain about the colder, fresher air on the hilltops, or the gliding passage of the Broadwings, or even the sand he had felt between his fingers on a magic shore?
Oh, I'm going to bed. At least I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
With that, Den turned towards his own bunk, that was barely 4 paces away along the opposite wall, identical to Gareth's, the covers fresh and new. He undid the girdle slowly and placed the sheath on his bed. Gareth reluctantly undid the clasps on his boots and slipped them off. The fastening of the surcoat gave him some trouble in the half-dark.
I am happy sometimes. I go out into the hills when I get tired of the old men who cannot or will not answer any important question.
He pulled apart the laces and drew the scarlet coat over his head.
I go because I do not have to pretend when I'm there. The people I do meet are simple and trusting. They ask no questions or wonder about you. But mostly, there's just the green, the blue, and the wind in your hair.
He busied himself with the black shirt.
You are a strange one, Gareth Seth Fingor.
Den's anger had disappeared.
And you spoke the truth just now. They did ask me to keep an eye on you, to make sure you did not sneak off any more. I suspect they would want me to repeat what you tell me.
He lifted his eyes to meet those of the younger boy.
Why do they want you watched?
I know what they are, Den, and they hate me. Now they've taken the only joy I have. You want me to smile? Help me then. Come with me one day, just one day, and I'll smile all the time.
And what exactly are they?
Liars?
Suddenly sure, Gareth stood up.
Would you lend me your blade for a moment?
My blade? What for?
Just a moment, I promise.
Reluctantly, Den unsheathed the blade and offered it hilt first. Gareth gripped the hilt with both hands. He closed his eyes and felt around in his mind. Then he let it go with a little sigh and reached deep inside himself for what he knew was there. He felt the blade shudder and opened his eyes. The crystalline angles extended themselves impossibly, reshaping and expanding the blade a full yard. He could feel the blood gushing in his veins. Something like elation pulsed in his head. For a moment anything seemed possible.
Sweet Imran's breath!
Den was awestruck.
This is impossible!
He was on his feet, backing away towards the window.
Are you a sorcerer, Gareth?
His voice rang oddly in the room.
There it is. I prove to you that you believe falsehoods, and you call me a sorcerer. But the questers never lie, do they, Den? Well, now you have something important to tell them. Gareth is a sorcerer.
He lowered the blade. Silently it contracted to the dagger-sized weapon.
Hold on. Give me a moment to collect my thoughts.
Den seated himself on the windowsill.
You've never touched the blade before?
Gareth smiled at him in triumph.
Today was my first time, I swear.
Den let out his breath slowly.
When did you find out?
In the temple, while we were on guard. I just thought a little, and then I knew it. But I didn't know it for sure till now.
You just thought a little. What type of thinking is that?
Gareth pondered this for a while.
Not thinking so much, more knowing, like believing you can, and then you can.
It sounded silly, even to his ears.
That's all?
That's all.
Den vaulted off the sill.
I don't know. There's something you won't or can't tell me. It takes cycles to learn to do it properly.
That's what you've been told. And I just proved to you it's not so. It doesn't say much for your intelligence.
What?
Den pretended to be shocked.
You impertinent little...
Now, there's nothing you can tell me that I haven't already heard from my tutors.
Gareth casually completed his undressing and donned his nightshirt. Den was halfway through his when the thought struck him.
By the stone. Do you think I could also...
Why not?
Gareth stretched himself out luxuriously and put his hands behind his head. He tried to hide his smile. The other boy now gripped the blade nervously.
And it's not sorcery.
There was a snicker in response.
You're just scared, that's all.
Den clenched his teeth and set his face in a look of determination. For a good while he concentrated and struggled, till the perspiration stood out on his bare arms and glazed the contours of his face, before he gave up in exasperation. He flopped down on his bed and tossed the blade aside. Gareth had refrained from encouragement or coaxing, and instead looked for an explanation for the ability that had seemed simply to come to him unlooked for. When he believed he had found it, he waited till the other boy had exhausted himself before speaking.
I don't think you can do it yet. There's something you must do beforehand.
Then shot him an accusing glance.
Why did you let me make the attempt then?
I only thought of it now.
And you've done this thing?
He rose up to sheathe the blade sullenly.
By accident.
Gareth seemed to hesitate.
Well, what is it?
You are not going to like it.
Tell me, confound you.
You have to go back to the temple, alone.
The temple?
You've been presented. It's not forbidden, I think. But you'll have to go at night, when you'll not be disturbed, and touch the stone.
What? Are you insane? That's definitely forbidden. Not even the High Quester would do it. In fact, that's what it's out of the question, that's all. And besides, it's kept locked up. I couldn't get in.
There is another way.
Gareth was staring at him now, wide-eyed.
I don't know. Why do you look at me like that?
Behind Euban's desk is a passage to an alcove high up in the temple dome. There is a grill, but if you want to, you'll find it's a simple matter to get to the arena.
No, I don't want to hear it.
He got up to put on his shirt.
I will rather wait for them to teach me, Gareth.
He stepped over to extinguish the torch.
Your way has a ring of...
Sorcery?
Gareth groaned.
You would have made a better priest than I did.
Speed
Malvor's voice echoed round the courtyard.
is our essential weapon. You cannot hope to contend with a numerically superior enemy by trading blows. No, you have to mete out 4 or 5 times the punishment you receive.
He let his gaze travel over the 14 youths, allowing it to linger for a moment on Gareth, who was looking small and out of place.
We can never match the size of an enemy force on the field of battle. We can never overcome with brute force and sheer weight of numbers. We do not fight battles we cannot win, unless they would buy us critical time. We retreat, we wait, and when the adversary has stretched himself too thin, we strike with the swiftness of a broadwing.
Imran's orb peered over the eastern battlements at these words, as if in silent validation. The morning watch had to be spent at least 2 hours. Malvor quickened his pace.
You will master the ability to move more swiftly than any opponent you may face within the next 4 or 5 10 days. You will learn to strike not only with speed, but also precision and accuracy. Speed by itself will profit little on the battlefield, apart from keeping out of harm's way. This you will achieve through constant practice and unrivaled instruction.
Now he turned to the 3 silent men behind him.
These men have trained scores of cadets like yourselves. They will hone your ability to concentrate, your skill with the blade, the way you move in battle, and most importantly, they will instill in you the will to triumph, without which your abilities are merely dry leaves before the wind. Do not be too eager to rush into battle without being thoroughly prepared. If you want a long career as a soldier, you will have need of every bit of wisdom, wit, and skill you can acquire.
Malvor nodded to the 3 men. Then he addressed the line of boys one final time.
You will be rotated in 3 groups under Masters Igrith, Plio, and Greason for the remainder of Suntide, as well as the entire High Suntide season. Accord them the same respect you would me, and be warned, in case of dispute, I will always take their part. May you have a productive day.
The captain had no sooner turned his back than the boys were jostled into 3 groups and escorted to their training arenas by their respective masters. They had been instructed to leave their blades locked away for the first sessions of training, and this improved Gareth's mood considerably. He would start out with Master Igrith, who seemed to be the least intimidating of the 3, in archery, then disappeared with another group. The morning passed quite uneventfully and far more enjoyably than he had anticipated. Although Nurians traditionally had little use for bows on the battlefield, they were used extensively in siege warfare to inflict heavy casualties on the besieging forces. A significant level of skill was therefore regarded as essential for every Nurian soldier. A couple of the boys had handled bows before while hunting, but none of them were able to bend the tall air bows used in warfare. Egrith explained that it was not merely brute force that enabled one to bend the bows, but rather a combination of skill and strength, both of which would be developed over the seasons ahead. He looked critically at Gareth and emphasized that they should not become despondent or impatient, since it might take them a little longer than their enthusiasm would demand. During the afternoon watch, training was suspended for a special event. The entire garrison, including the initiates, had to form up outside the South or King's Gate. Even the current guards were not excused. There was a sense of excitement pervading all, but soon the rumors reached them that the king was moving Nurian forces southwards to aid their Ligurian allies in some secret enterprise. The younger men could be seen jesting and smiling at the prospect of a campaign in the south, but no one knew who would be selected, though the chosen few would certainly be envied and congratulated. The atmosphere at the gate was very different. The king spoke but a few words and left most of the instructions to Captain Melvor. In his customary terse manner, the captain informed them that only 20 royal guardsmen would leave for Ligurium on the next 10th day, accompanied by 200 auxiliaries assembled at Store. The Nurian forces would be under the command of Prince Lucane. None of the Belruth Guard would be involved as yet. The Nurian forces would remain in the south until Lysan had been subverted, and the countryside and Tristwood purged of marauders and raiders. There was the possibility, therefore, that a second contingent of guardsmen would be sent to Lysan after the initial conquest. There was a stir of excitement at this, even as there had been a hush of disappointment at first. But when the call for volunteers was issued, hardly a man did not raise a hand. Melvor selected 20 of the older campaigners, men who had crossed the pass into Erin, and it was clear that he, at least, did not believe it would be a quick or easy campaign. 3 days later, on the 10th day, they marched off in the direction of the fortress of Store, with the prince at their head. Instead of the much-anticipated day of leisure and the accompanying opportunity to see Riot, Gareth and the other initiates were sent on a rigorous route march that left them exhausted and grumbling by the time they returned that night, just before the second watch. They had trudged across country in an easterly direction since first light, and had been forced to cross the Stillwater before turning southwards towards Tew. Then they had returned at a blistering pace by means of the roadway. There were more than 1 or 2 groans emitting from the tub-room that evening. Gareth had thought with much regret of his little friend in the western hills, and the promise he had made him. He was not yet sure of Den, however, and since the latter hardly ever lost sight of him, he would have to be a part of any prohibited attempt to reach Riad. Oddly, Den had started his training in a different group, that of Master Greason, who instructed them in the physical skills of strength and swiftness of movement. This was the part of the training that Gareth secretly dreaded, since it involved pitting one's abilities against one's fellow trainees, all of whom were older and stronger than he was. Den found the training in this group strenuous, and would complain of it when they were alone. They had not referred to the episode with the blade since the night on which it had happened, but it was clear that it had had a profound effect on the way Den regarded the younger boy, and even the tutors and instructors. Sometimes he would catch Gareth's eye at mealtimes when the discussions among the initiates were infused with the urgent desire to learn the secrets of the blades. The knowing look would end in a slight smile, and this confidence seemed to set them apart from the rest as well as draw them together. Over the next 10 days an easy friendship developed between them, the friction of the presentation night having faded to shadow. They shared their respective experiences of the training they underwent during the day, often with demonstrations and much hilarity. The other boys seemed to be uncomfortable around him, however, and uncertain as to placing him. He knew that their behavior did not merely stem from the fact that he was so much younger and the son of the king, and this knowledge brought to him a certain sense of anger and shame. When Den was with him, though, the others accepted him readily enough. It was always good to have the older boy at his side. When they were told that the second 10th day of training would be used for leisure and rest, he had already made up his mind about his new friend. If he could not induce him to accompany him, Gareth was sure that Den would look the other way when he disappeared into the hills. Even with this alliance forged, he would have to walk the tightrope over Melvor's watchfulness and dire warnings. Den was evasive when approached, nervously declining the offer. It was understandable, of course, yet his demeanor prompted a vague suspicion in Gareth. Nevertheless, he had no real option but to brave the guards at the sheep gate that morning, for he knew that Riot would never understand his absence for 2 consecutive 10th days. To his slow mind it would smack of betrayal and abandonment. Gareth waited till the 4th watch was about to be replaced by the morning watch before he approached. He knew that the guards would be thinking of little else but their imminent relief and relaxation. They would not be bothered with him or his fabricated errand. Moreover, the morning watch would not know that he had gone out so early. He felt a twinge of guilt at using Melvor's name in his supposed errand, but then the captain had used him several times previously for similar tasks. It was only fair that he could also reap some benefit from all the effort. Although it was painfully obvious that Raed was at once delighted and relieved to see him, it took several precious hours before they were once more comfortably unaware of what had transpired during the previous 2 10 days. Gareth had more sense than to tell Raed of his own adventures in the temple, but he painted the ceremony in elaborate detail, inventing 1 or 2 features along the way. He did not dwell on the training in which he was involved, for he knew it would only widen the gap between them, and instead played it down to the level of forced labor compared to the freedom a shepherd enjoyed. Nonetheless, he could see that Riot only half believed him, and noticed how the boy would constantly steal glances at the uniform he wore. He regretted no longer being able to slip in and out of the gates in a simple tunic. It would have been much easier to disregard the differences of which they were now painfully reminded by his very appearance. It was only when they were once more gleefully splashing the cold showers of the dark weeds water at each other that they were no more than 2 boys, anonymous and unaware, and could laugh freely without the gloom of separation that would settle again with the eventide. Gareth forced all thoughts of his caged life from his mind, and simply immersed himself in the sunlight, the water, the very air. For a while he would be free from the ties of responsibility that were inexorably dragging him away from what he loved. Riot was cheerful again and bright-eyed, but Gareth noted a hint of hysteria in his laughter, as if his friend knew that this was but a brief respite in a war that could not be won. Despite this, he enjoyed the warm hours in the soaking sun, allowing his mind to float with the clouds. The river bank had an unmistakable aroma during suntide, a mixture of the lush hill grasses, the welter of reeds and rushes at the water's edge, and an intensified, verdant odor from the scattered needle trees. It was almost intoxicating, a soothing fragrance that evoked a myriad of memories, all blurred by time into a happy whole. Surely nothing could invade such tranquility or despoil such peace. When they had dried themselves in the afternoon sun, the heat became intolerable. Even the insects forsook the sunny patches and took to the shade. The boys retired to a mossy enclave close to the water's edge, where they had left their clothes. Out of the sun's stare, they could keep a lazy eye on the sheep dotting the hillside. Gareth produced 2 peaches he had smuggled through the gate with him, and for a while they ate in silence. The enclave allowed some of the rushing water to slow into a pool, where the surface was calm enough to reflect the dancing light into the shade. He could see every pebble and flitting movement under the water clearly, where the shadow of the canopy blocked the slanting rays. An odd play of reflection cast the rippling sunlight off the surface onto their bodies and the surrounding trees in dark greenish waves. He leaned back against the sturdy trunk behind him, the roughness scratching his skin, and sighed. Its solidity was somehow comforting, a substance that resisted change and fleeting time. He closed his eyes, but could still see the dancing patterns, the bright sunny greenery on the opposite bank. Riot still formed between, his arms round his knees, lost in thought. He opened his eyes abruptly and stood up.
I will have to go, Riot.
The face looked up at him, pleading.
You will come again?
It was easy to reassure him.
Of course. It is simple enough for me to get away. I am hardly noticed. When will you come? 10th day. If they do not think up something silly for us to do.
He smiled down at the other boy, who did not return it in kind, but merely sat staring. The undulations of wavy light pulsed across the frozen features of his upturned face and gave them an ethereal quality. A chill touch of premonition sent a sudden shudder through Gareth's body, and he let the smile fade. He turned away abruptly to dress himself. After a moment or two, Riot followed suit. He was quiet, but not sullen, as was his habit when he could not get his way. Gareth interpreted this as a sign that he did comprehend the situation and had settled into an uneasy acceptance. He was tightening his girdle when Riot came back to life.
What is that?
He excitedly pointed at the gilt clasp, enraptured.
The buckle? It was a gift. That is, I'm allowed to wear it because...
He cursed the thing in his mind, and himself for bringing it out there. Here was just another reminder of the social gulf between them. He hastily unbuckled the girdle and held it out to his friend.
Would you like to look at it?
Riot held it almost reverently at arm's length. His fingers slowly traced the outline of the dragon and naming sigil. His voice was barely audible.
It's beautiful.
Gareth smiled to himself. Riot was so easily distracted, so easily pleased. At once he knew what to do.
How would you like to keep it till next 10th day?
Something tugged at his memory. What had Lucain told him? Wear it all the time. He could still see the little frown between his brother's eyes, could feel the surge of pride inside himself. But surely the clasp belonged to him now, and could be employed according to his desires. Who would notice if he did not wear it for 9 days? Lucain had left for Ligurium with the Nurian forces. His father rarely noticed him. Melvor seemed preoccupied with other matters at present. No, he was sure he could risk it. It was apparent that his offer pleased Riot immensely. He was looking at his friend in wonderment, as if it were a jest only.
Put it on then.
He helped Riot to strap the leather girdle round his waist.
You cannot wear this in the town, though. People would think you stole it or something. You will have to hide it when you go back in the evenings.
He suddenly realized the potential for danger his action would create.
I doubt even if your parents would understand, right? It will be just our secret.
Yes, just our secret.
His face was split with a happy smile.
And if you're not coming, I can keep it till after.
Gareth laughed. His friend seemed almost eager for him to miss their next meeting. His plan had been all too successful.
Agreed.
The usually somber farewell had been swallowed completely by a feeling of light-heartedness that prevailed till he was well on his way back to Belruth. Then he fell to thinking about the captain, and what would happen if he were to find out where he had spent the day. He could not understand the enmity and disgust with which most everyone regarded the shepherd boy. He could not be held responsible for the circumstances leading to his birth. Now it seemed that it would hound him for his entire life. What would become of him? Brido and Gwilla were not Nurian, and they were both old. What would happen to their foster son when they were no longer there for him? Would the farmsteads in the western rim still trust this half-wit with their possessions? There was no question. As soon as he was able, he would bring his friend into the citadel, and not as someone scullion either. He would make sure that Raed was taught some craft of his liking, and no one would dare say a thing about it. That was certainly worth becoming a warrior for, to silence the tongues that were wagging about his friend, and also, mayhap, the tongues that were wagging about him. The shadows were long when he made his way across the cleared ground between the outer village and the sheep gate. The guards would have no reason to challenge him until after dark, though the first watch had already commenced. He would not have to repeat the lie about an errand for the captain. There was some commotion at the gate as he approached, and he held back to see what was transpiring. Two cloaked and hooded figures were engaged in animated conversation with the guards, who in their turn grew increasingly agitated. One of the latter finally burst out in anger, and showered the two with loud oaths, threatening to call out the rest of the guards. At this outburst the men hastily retreated, passing within a yard or two of where Gareth stood watching. They were large fellows, and despite the fine evening they were rendered unrecognizable by the heavy clothing they wore. Even their hands were hidden from sight by leather gloves. They paid him no attention. He wondered what their quarrel with the guards could have been. He recognized the guard that had done the shouting as Urit, an old hand at the sheep gate. He was still red-faced and muttering under his breath. Gareth's curiosity got the better of him.
Good even, Urit. Troublemakers?
The man was indignant.
Trouble finders, more like, Master Gareth. I know not where these rats crawled out of, but they are not from around here, or they would not dare threaten a guardsman. Picture that! Threaten me, they would, spending too much time in the taverns.
Gareth smiled at the form of address that Urit had employed for him since he had been a small boy.
Drunkards?
They be drunk on swine piss to lift their paws to a Belruth guard.
He spat behind him.
Did they attack you?
Huh? They would not be slinking away then. You would be searching for their remains. They were just words you do not use when addressing me, you see. Rabble. I have half a mind to pick 'em up later and have 'em chat to the captain.
But why would they threaten you?
Because I told them what they could do with their questions, that's why.
Gareth squeezed past him through the gate and had heaved an inward sigh of relief at this distraction before Urit's voice called him back.
Say, Master Gareth.
He turned, but did not draw closer. Mayhap the man had not noticed his missing girdle.
Yes?
These fellows did not seem familiar to you, perchance.
No, not at all.
He was mystified.
Odd, though. They seem to have taken an interest in you.
In me?
Asked a question or two in your direction as well. But I told them what I did.
He winked heavily and raised a hand in greeting. Gareth was more than apprehensive as he made his way to the dining hall. He remembered just in time to fetch his old girdle before joining the others at dinner. His bedroom seemed deserted, the early evening having stolen in and rendered it dark and mysterious. He could not understand the sudden fear that made him hesitate on the threshold. Certainly the captain would not be there to await his return in the dark. He shrugged and walked in, almost immediately becoming aware of the presence of a cloaked figure seated next to his bed. He froze and reproached himself silently, his head filled with hooded figures and angry captains. The man rose to his feet in silence. At least he was not hooded, Gareth thought. The starlight glinted on something silvery adorning the cloak. Prince Gareth? He did not recognize the voice, yet it held a note of familiarity. It certainly did not belong to the captain.
Yes?
Prince Gareth, I was instructed to let you know before any other.
Who are you?
You do not know me. I am Aristath from the Queen's Guard. She instructed me.
He hesitated.
What is it?
Even when he asked the question, he realized what the answer would be. The man audibly drew in his breath before responding.
The Queen, your mother, is dead.